excited to speak to you today. Jesus wants our friendship, because the only place we can find the fulfillment and satisfaction we yearn for is in communion with God. Our part in building this friendship consists of two things. One, seeking to know and love Christ through prayer, and seeking to follow Christ by fulfilling God's will for our lives. That phrase, God's will, can easily be misunderstood or used as an excuse to justify questionable personal agendas, whether violent, political, or self-indulgent. But as Catholics, we know where we go to find God's will. We go to Christ's example and teaching, both in the New Testament and in the Old. As we saw exampled in today's first reading, Christ wants us to avoid the sins of anger, arrogance, judgmentalism, gossip, lust, greed, laziness, dishonesty. These behaviors damage our friendship with Him and cause destruction to those around us. Jesus also tells us to love our neighbors as ourselves. To love our neighbors as ourselves. Sometimes I think it's easier to love our neighbor than God who's put most close to us, our family. Anger or forgiveness. One can consume us. The other can set us free. When I was a small boy, I used to come home from school and go to my grandmother's house. My parents were divorced. My mother was a working mom at the time. So I'd come home, eat my snack, and out the door I'd ran. My grandmother, God rest her soul, was always a wreck, trying to keep up with me. I was a handful, if you can guess. So one day, my mother and grandmother had a terrible fight. They argued and said horrible things and mean things to each other as I stood there. This is a reminder. If you think what you say or do in front of your children when you're angry will soon be forgotten, look at the scar I still bear. So out the door I went, my mother yanking me through the door, and as we walked out the door, she said to my grandmother, "I will never be back. I will never speak to you again." Down the steps we went, walked through the gate, turned left, walked 20 steps, and went into our own house. Kind of funny if you think about it. They only lived 20 steps apart. Less if you count cutting across the grass like I used to do. But for the next 20 years, they never spoke another word to each other. Now I, on the other hand, was over at my grandmother's house the very next day. See, I was no dummy. My mother couldn't cook. And if I was going to survive this war, I needed to befriend both sides. I was 6 or 7 years old, and I was negotiating land of Hunkle and the land of Scanlon. Now my mother and my grandmother were both Irish. Both had red hair. Yeah, you can tell. But they could never bring themselves to say they were sorry. They could never get over the anger that they both had within their hearts. My grandfather was cutting the grass one day, and I used to help him on Fridays. And he used to shake his head as my mother used to walk by my grandmother, where they would both sit on the porch looking at each other. Like this, and never trying to catch each other looking. But again, neither could find a place to put the anger within their hearts. And neither could say they were sorry. I think after a while they just didn't know how to do it. I still remember my grandfather saying to me, "Don't you ever do what your grandmother and mother are doing." And I never have. In my house, you have a fight, oh, it's a good one. But nobody goes away angry. We say we're sorry, we say we love you, and we go. Never not talking, because that scar will never heal inside of me, and I don't want my children to ever bear that scar. Now, my father, during that 20 years, had come back. He had recovered from alcoholism. He came back to care for my mother, who was almost killed in a car crash. Still, no words were spoken. My grandfather one time was raking the grass finally and fell and broke his hip. You could see both faces of my mother and grandmother, both hoping he would recover. But sadly, he did not. He needed to go into a nursing home. And sometimes I think that was God's will. It was God's will that he fell, because suddenly they had no choice. They had to face each other and talk about their future. I still believe neither could say they were sorry about the horrible anger they carried within themselves for all those years. But for the sake of my grandfather, they moved forward. And my mother and grandmother, for the remainder of my grandparents' lives, had a normal mother and daughter relationship. And I think my grandfather, even though he never said a word, was thrilled that he had his family back after all that time. So for you today, what anger do you carry inside you? And what will you do to empty it from your hearts? Jesus wants the temple of our hearts to be filled with his friendship and forgiveness, not with anger. So when he comes to us in this Mass today, let us open our hearts to him and let him clean out all the pain and anger so that his friendship and forgiveness can flourish within us. My friends in Christ, never let 20 steps turn into 20 years. Our lives are just too short.